Welcome to the MBTA commuter Zoom workshop meeting, 6 o'clock. And I'm going to turn it right over to the consultants since that's the only screen I'm looking at. So, who wants to start?
Okay, I'll give a quick introduction.
Okay.
So as you recall, the planning board was able to get an EEA planning assistance grant to do the work that the state is requiring us to do under the MBTA community zoning. We were lucky enough to hire Emily Innes at Innes Associates and her subconsultants at RKG, Eric Halverson and Chris, dang it, I don't remember Chris's last name, Hurlich, I believe. And I'm very pleased to be able to be working with this team, especially since Emily and Eric worked very closely with DHCD to create the model that every MBTA community will be using to help each community comply with the new requirements. And I know you've heard enough from me now, so I'd love to turn it over to Emily and to Eric.
Thank you very much, Maren. Thank you, Mark, and members of the planning board. We're very happy to be here tonight. I'm going to walk you through our agenda, but I'm going to start off by saying you're going to see this screen twice. We are going to do a poll later on, so you can either type in the URL there for SurveyMonkey, or if you've got a smartphone with you, you can click on the QR code. That'll take you there. You'll see the screen again later on. So if you don't quite catch it before I move on to the agenda, you'll be able to start up again before we get to the actual poll itself, but just wanted to let you know. And the reason we're doing it like this and not through the webinar is because this is being live streamed. So people who are watching this at home and not on Zoom, or maybe catch it at a later rerun, will be able to participate in the poll. And people who review this after this is posted will also be able to do the poll. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about the poll and a companion survey that we have later. For those of you who have Zoom, this isn't exactly the controls that you'll see at the bottom. I didn't have a webinar controls, but you should look to the bottom of your screen, and instead of chat, you'll see Q&A. So we don't have a comment function enabled, partly because of open meeting law and partly because we're about to give you a lot of complex information and we'd love your full attention. But we do have this Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the meeting, please type them in there, and we're going to answer them at 2 specific points. I'll tell you when later. And then depending on how long we've taken, we may have an opening for even more questions and answers. And then the gallery view up here in the left to see everyone there. And the mute is not important for a webinar. So let me talk to you a little bit about our agenda. We're going to be talking about the process of this study and what we're doing, and a little bit about the fact that it's a follow-on from a lot of previous public engagement and studies. We're going to talk at a high level about the current zoning that we're testing. Then Eric's going to take over and talk about that model Maren mentioned and how we applied it as a team to this particular study, to what Littleton has as its current zoning or proposed zoning. And then we're going to talk about some of the implications of that model. And then finally, because of the implications of what the model is telling us, we'd like to talk with you about different building typologies, different types of multifamily, and interact with you both in the poll and the Q&A about what you think of those typologies, because we think that there's some real options for Littleton here. So as I said, it's a lot of information. After the compliance model discussion, after Eric's presentation, we're going to stop and take some questions just on the technical aspects, because it's a lot of information to hear the technical aspect and then listen to the building typologies and then ask questions. So again, feel free to use the Q&A to ask your questions all the way through, but we'll stop there, answer some of the technical questions. And then after we go through the building typologies and the poll, we'll stop again and have a Q&A on the building typologies and any additional technical or process questions that come up. So with that, I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of the process overview. So this planning process is really about evaluating your current zoning and your draft zoning. So you already have a draft form, an approved form-based code. You've got a draft smart growth overlay district. And so our first question is, do the districts comply as they are now, either in actual or in draft form? If they don't comply, which zoning changes are required for compliance, and which changes will the community support? So this is a community-based process. It's not the state told us that we have to do something and therefore we have to do it only one particular way. There are options, and tonight's discussion and then a later public meeting, which I'll talk about in a moment, are really getting to what are the options, what are the right solutions for Littleton. So that's the third part of this. And then once we hear back on that, once we have a better understanding of what the preferences are for those options, then it's drafting zoning that meets the requirements of the MBTA Community Act that can go to town meeting for review and approval. And there's obviously a public process associated with that. So just very high level, Section 3A is the MBTA Communities Act. It is part of Mass General Laws, Chapter 40A, which is the Zoning Act. It does require that MBTA communities allow multifamily housing as of right, and there are some requirements, some legislative requirements for the zoning district. It has to be at least one district of reasonable size. It has to have a minimum gross density of 15 units per acre, which are subject to certain limitations in terms of what is considered the denominator of that gross density. It has to be located not more than 0.5 miles from a commuter rail station or other transit station. And obviously commuter rail station is what applies to Littleton. And the regulations in allowing multifamily as a right, it means there can't be certain restrictions. So the housing can't be restricted by age, and it must also permit multifamily housing that is suitable for families with children. Now, accompanying the Zoning Act, DHCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, released guidelines for the interpretation of the act last year. They released a series of draft guidelines roughly this time last year, and then the final guidelines were released in August with an amendment in October. And this extremely busy slide is not for you to read now, but all of this is going to be posted on the town's website if it isn't already, but will be shortly. And this is so you can refer back to some of the definitions. So the items that are in the table here, these are the requirements that apply to Littleton. So you are a commuter rail community. The basis of the required housing is the 2020 housing units from the 2020 census. So here's yours, 3,889. And based on the formula, so if you follow the numbers here, that will take you to the definitions for each of the terms, and in some cases to the calculations for 2 and 3 here. So you can follow the math and follow the definitions through on your own, but basically you have a minimum requirement of zoning that will allow for 750 units over a minimum land area of 50 acres. And within that, you have to have 244 units. You have to have a percent of your district located in the station area is 20%. So 244 units. So we're going to be talking, when Eric gets to the model, he's going to be talking through all of that and how that applies to the community. Where we are in the timeline, so we kicked this off back in November with a policy workshop with some of the elected officials. And we created a public outreach plan, had a further discussion with the planning board on that to try and understand timelines for town meeting. And then we delivered our initial analysis mid-January, chatted back and forth with Maren about it. And really what you're going to see today is that basis of the initial analysis with just a couple of tweaks to make it a little bit more understandable for people who haven't had their heads in the model for the last 6 to 8 months. So right here, we're at the online public meeting. Obviously, we are looking at having a second public meeting on March 8th. And that will very much draw from what we hear tonight and from the survey that's going to be open. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. Once we've had those two meetings, we're going to be drafting the zoning. And in fact, you've gone a long way already, right? So it's tweaking what you have and making sure that it works based on what we've heard. And then after that draft is set, we've reviewed it with Maren. It's moving into the municipal process for approving a article on the warrant for town meeting, and then obviously town meeting's own approval process. So this is really tied to past planning efforts. It's not that this is just sort of coming out of the blue simply in response to the MBTA Communities Act. You have, in fact, done a lot of planning for zoning already. King Street Common, obviously, and there was a whole public process around that you can see on here. And in fact, you're in the process of amending it right now. Or potentially amending it. And then Littleton Station Village, again, there have been quite a few rounds of public process in that. And so as part of this, we're not starting from scratch, right? We're starting from the work that the community has already done to evaluate this zoning. And as we look at these two areas, first of all, we have to look at the geography of it. So King Street, obviously here with the proposed district expansion here in green, and sort of keep these maps in mind. You'll see some variation of this as Eric goes through the model. And then for Littleton Station, this was our kickoff of just looking at that half-mile radius around the station and trying to understand what's there now in terms of development and what could be there. So this was part of the initial discussion and initial analysis. And then the model relies on dimensional standards in the zoning to test to understand what the zoning capacity can be. And again, I think this has been mentioned many times in the MBTA. It's not that the town itself is going to develop housing. They are not with the town of Littleton. No town is going to go out and physically build housing itself. What the requirement is to set the rules to allow for the development of a certain amount of housing. And so in order to understand how much housing that can be, we have to understand what the dimensional restrictions around, as well as the use restrictions are. So this is what is at King Street Common right now. And then also the draft Littleton Station Village 40R. You can see lot size, building coverage, height, parking spaces per dwelling unit, and the maximum residential density. These are all components that fit into the model that allows the model to calculate the anticipated capacity based on those dimensional standards. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric so he can talk about how we took this information, both geography and dimensional standards, and input that into the model. And Eric, just tell me when you need me to move the slide.
Will do. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Eric Halverson with RKG Associates. I'm going to talk for a little while about the analysis that we've completed thus far for Littleton and looking at how some potential districts could help to create a compliant application for Littleton going forward, and some of the different options, as Emily mentioned, that could be available to the town as it pursues potential compliance. So we'll talk about the requirements. I'll share a little bit about the districts that we looked at. I'll talk a little bit more about the zoning parameters, as Emily was mentioning. We'll share at least the preliminary model results, and then some potential questions and pathways for compliance. Next. Great. So just reiterating what Emily went over at the beginning, and I saw there was a question in the chat around the percentage of units that are located in the station. So hopefully this will answer that question. Littleton is a commuter rail category community. Your base housing unit count is the 3,889. When you do all the multiplication, your minimum multifamily unit capacity across your districts is 750 units. The minimum land area for a district or districts, depending on how Littleton pursues compliance, is 50 acres in total. Then we get to, because you're a commuter rail community, you have to have 20% of that 50 acres located within a half mile of the station area. So that 20% equals 10 acres within the half mile. And then you have to have 20% of that 750 units located within the half mile, which is the 150 units. The 244 that Emily referred to earlier was just the total acreage within the half mile. So it's actually 150 units that Littleton would need to place within the half mile or more, depending on what the town wanted to do. And then the minimum gross density for the districts is the 15 dwelling units per acre. So those 5 sort of metrics or measurements, starting from the 750 units and working your way down to 15 dwelling units, those 5 are really critical. And those are, the really big ones that we need to try and meet or exceed as we are testing the zoning against the districts. Thank you. So in order to actually run the MBTA's compliance model for Littleton or really any community, we first have to identify where the actual districts are and what parcels comprise those districts. And in the case of Littleton, as I mentioned, the district or combination of districts have to total 50 acres in size, with the minimum of 10 acres being located within that half mile. So there's a couple of additional layers that the guidelines pose for communities. One is one district has to be a minimum of 25 acres in size. And then if you have districts above and beyond the one that's 25 acres, it can't be smaller than 5 acres in size. So your first one or your primary district has to be 25 acres. If you need more districts above that, which in this case Littleton would, they can't be smaller than 5 acres in size. Especially if they're not contiguous or next to each other. So based on all the great work the town's already done, we started with 5 districts that we were going to test. 3 of them are within the station area, within the half mile station area, and generally follow the work that was undertaken through the Smart Growth Overlay District. The other is examining the impacts of King Street Common and what it would look like if we included that area, where we know the town's been very active in looking at multifamily housing up there. So what would it look like if we include those? Next. So we prepared just 2 sets of maps to orient you to the different districts and the parcels that we were looking at. So for the Smart Growth Overlay District, we just called these District 1, 2, and 3. District 1 starts at the most northerly, it's colored yellow. District 2 is sort of in the middle, it's green. District 3 is the most southerly district, which is highlighted here in red. You can see that all of the parcels that we're looking at are within that half mile purple circle, with the station and the T at the station being in the center of that district. And they're all sort of, just to orient you, they're all on the 2 corners of the interchange with Route 2 and 495 and mostly along Foster Street. Next. And then we just look at King Street. So there's 2 options here, generally the same vicinity, but 2 different options that we were looking at. One is the option 1 is in blue, and that's sort of what I refer to as kind of the original King Street, the IBM campus. It's been going through that process with the town. And then King Street option 2 incorporates the orange parcels. So the one parcel kind of on the northeast corner of the blue parcel, and then what's been recently discussed that's been in front of the town, which are the orange parcel where the old mill building is at the corner of King Street and Great Road or 2A. So in total, there's 3 districts down by the station and then 2 potential options for King Street. So when we analyze the districts, we first need to start with the size of the districts, just to make sure that they're going to, at least one of them is going to meet the 25 acre minimum, and then that the rest of them would meet or exceed the 5 acre minimum if they weren't contiguous. So this chart, and you'll see all the charts that we show are color coded following the colors that were on those maps. So you can look at the gross acres for each of the 5 district options. And then we have a column on the right that says, does it meet the station area requirement? So of course, because District 1, 2, and 3 are within the half mile, they do. King Street is not within the half mile, therefore that's why you see a no there. Although the size of those districts at 40 plus acres are large enough to kind of be your singular district. And all of them are larger than 5 acres in size. So that means we're able to test all of those districts for their unit capacity, which is kind of the next step. To test the districts for unit capacity, the model requires us to input a series of zoning assumptions because effectively what the model does is it runs a build out scenario on every single parcel in every single district that a town wants to consider. So if you think about it, the model takes each individual parcel, it applies a set of zoning assumptions, and then that creates a sort of an output for unit count or unit capacity. The primary zoning parameters that the model really runs off of are listed on the screen. Minimum lot size, the building height. In this case, we translate building height if it's in feet to stories. If your community governs land by floor area ratio, in the case of King Street, it does. In the case of the overlay district, at least as written today, it doesn't. If there's any building coverage, so the maximum amount of a parcel that a building footprint can cover, in King Street, it's 50%. In the overlay district, there isn't one. The open space requirement, the model needs to understand how much open space may get set aside that can't be built on when it calculates unit capacity. In the case of both King Street and the overlay district, right now King Street is set at 0. The overlay district set at 5%. The model actually defaults at 20%, and that's so we can account for things like setbacks as part of open space. The model takes the setbacks into account through the open space requirement, but we also just have to input setbacks to make sure that any setbacks that are being used in the zoning aren't going to restrict development. So for example, if someone's zoning had 150-foot front yard setback and the parcels were only 200 feet deep, we would consider that to be detrimental to development, and the DHCD would want to know that and flag that. We also have to look at parking because we need to be able to calculate how much parking would be needed, particularly if it was surface parking. That needs to be removed so that it doesn't count toward the building footprint. And then the last metric is if your community limits the dwelling units per acre. As we know, we need to hit 15 or more dwelling units per acre per the requirements. So if your district caps the dwelling units per acre, in this case for the overlay district, say at 12, if we were only considering the smart growth overlay district, we would have a really hard time getting to 15 if the dwelling units are capped at 12. So that's why we have to capture that in the model. Next, please. So when we run the district size and the zoning through the model on a parcel by parcel basis, this is a summary table of the results. As you work across the table from top to bottom, we have the requirements in the second column. So you can see the district acreage requirements is 50. If you follow it across each of the 5 districts, you can see none of them individually hit the 50 number, which is an indicator to us that we either need to make one of them larger or we can have a multi-district strategy for compliance. And I think, at least in our discussions with the town so far, that might be the way that we want to go. The density denominator, this is how we calculate dwelling units per acre. It's the total acreage of the district minus things like water bodies that could never be developed on, wetlands that couldn't be developed on. There's a couple of other things that have to come out of the total acreage to create land that could actually be built on. And the guidelines in DHCD tell us what those things are that have to be stripped out. Then we have the acreage within the transit area. So again, we have to hit 10 acres. Going across the 3 districts that actually fall within the half mile, all of them exceed the 10 acres. Then we have unit capacity. We have to hit 750 or more as we go across. The 3 that are within the half mile station area don't currently meet 750 as they are today, but the King Street ones do exceed that. So thinking about the role that the King Street district could play in compliance becomes really important because there is a lot of unit capacity there. We have units within the transit station area. We have to hit 150. 2 of the districts, District 1 and District 3, exceed that right now. District 2, which was the smaller one in the middle, is just short. And then we have our dwelling unit per acre measure, and you can see the districts around the train station and the overlay district don't meet the 15, but King Street gets us up to 20. So again, a combination potentially of using King Street with a higher unit capacity and a higher density, combined with maybe a district in, we would have to combine it with a district in the station area. If we're able to combine those 2, we could probably get to the 15 dwelling units per acre. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about some of the different options that might be here, just following up on what I mentioned, we feel pretty strongly that it would be a good idea to include King Street, at least as part of your compliance because of the unit capacity. You already have sort of a project in front of you, potentially 2 projects in front of you. The district acreage is really high, the density denominators are really high, and the dwelling units per acre are really high. And we like that because it gives you more flexibility with what to do down at the station area and could potentially allow the town to lower density down at the station area because you already have pretty high density up at King Street. So it gives us some options. And then just looking at the districts that are around the station, as I mentioned, all 3 districts meet the 10-acre minimum, and 2 out of the 3 meet the unit capacity numbers, but none of them as currently situated, if we were only going to look at districts in the half-mile area, meet the dwelling units per acre. So if we just wanted to consider District 1, 2, or 3, we would either have to make them, well, we'd have to make some of them bigger or do a combination of districts to meet the acreage requirements. And we would have to consider how to get more units here because none of them meet the dwelling units per acre metric. So again, that's why I think bringing King Street in is maybe important for the town. Next. And then this is just a summary table that goes over everything we just talked about at the bottom, organized by district. But some of the questions that we had that Emily and I had and we posed to the town is kind of what is the goal of compliance? Is it to sort of reach the minimum requirements of the guidelines, or is there a potential opportunity to maybe exceed the guidelines? And is that even desirable in Littleton? Which King Street option should we include if we're going to include one? Is it the just sort of the blue district, the first one, or the blue plus the orange? And then what district or districts would we want to include around the transit station? We have the option of maybe just including one. Is it a bigger one? Is it a smaller one? And then sort of what does that decision get us in terms of compliance? And then the last one is, should we consider kind of a mix of housing options in the overlay district within the half-mile radius if we're considering King Street? For our preliminary calculations, if we include King Street, there's the potential that we could get District 1 or District 3 down into like the 9 or 10 dwelling units per acre instead of the 12 to 20 that I think was originally envisioned for at least parts of those districts. So I think it gives us some wiggle room and maybe opens up some options to consider some housing typologies that maybe when at least we started this process, we weren't really sure if they were going to be viable, at least trying to comply with the guidelines. And I think I kind of just went over everything that's on the slide.
So we're going to stop there and just take a few questions that we're seeing on the technical aspects of it. I'll read out sort of the more recent one, and then Maren, maybe you can see if there's any others you want us, either Eric or myself, to answer. So one is, would bus service from the King Street area to the train station be required in order to include the units in the formula, to include those units as part of the MBTA? Eric, I don't know if you want to take that one or if you want me to take that one.
Sure, I can give it a shot. Just if we're talking about the guidelines and compliance with MBTA requirements, this would be outside of that. This is really a zoning compliance exercise. I think, John, your question would probably be, more toward the town and sort of how they want to structure zoning and any potential transportation mitigation that might come along with future development.
Yeah, and just to add on to Eric's point, there is a requirement for acreage within the station area, but that's for the commuter rail station. You are allowed to have more than one district, as Eric mentioned earlier, and the other district or districts do not have to be within the train station area or within a transit area in as long as you've met your minimum. Now, good planning is another matter, and planning near transit is always good, but in terms of the guidelines, you don't have to have all of the acreage within either train or bus. Let's see. Do the King Street Common 1 and SGOD 2 districts combined meet the state requirements?
That's a great question. In our modeling, and I played with this a little bit because District 2 is the smallest in terms of its acreage, but as the zoning at least is set up today that we tested in the model, we fall short of the 150 units that we would need to comply with the guidelines if we use just District 2. So what that would mean would be we would probably need to increase the zoning a bit to get District 2 closer to the 14 to 15 dwelling unit per acre. Right now, I think District 2 is coming in around 12. So we would need to tweak it, but with those tweaks, I think we could get District 2 and one of the King Street in combination to potentially meet the guidelines. But that's something we're kind of playing with and why we want to hear, from all of you about different combinations and things that you're interested in.
Then another question, we already exceed affordable housing requirements, and this is adding 20% more housing at a minimum. Can't see that it makes sense in terms of town infrastructure to exceed this requirement too. And I'll note, and Eric, feel free to jump in, that the MBTA, the Zoning Act 3A, is not requiring affordable housing, simply housing. There is an option under the guidelines to add an affordable housing requirement, but that's a local preference. The law itself is not speaking to whether or not these units are affordable or market rate, just that they are housing units that otherwise meet the guidelines. Maren, this might be one for you. Have there been any studies or plans considering how all this traffic will affect Foster Street?
Sure, I'm happy to take that one. Thank you, Emily. The planning board would review traffic if and when a development proposal is put forward. The current work is just to propose zoning that the town will support at town meeting to meet the MBTA guidelines.
And I'll just add to that we don't actually know how many units will be created in this area yet because we haven't come up with the draft zonings, so or could be created in this area. And that's partly why we're here tonight, is to get your input into that. And then there was a process question about town meeting. Did you want to answer that live, Maren, or were you typing?
Sure. I'm happy to answer that. Yeah.
Okay.
So the question is, if this gets voted down at town meeting, landowners would have to follow the current zoning. And yes, that's true. Unless and until rezoning is passed, then the current zoning of mostly industrial A for those parcels would remain in place.
And then one final question, cut in right before I was going to switch back to the presentation, but it's a good question. What is the cost of non-compliance? How much state funding would the town miss out on? So
I'll jump in on that one. I've been referring to it as the $20 million question for Littleton, between infrastructure grants, the low interest loans from the state for town sewer, and the housing choice grants. Those three buckets, we anticipate that would be close to $20 million over the next 8 to 10 years. Well, that amount that we wouldn't qualify for.
And there are two others, so we're going to take those two and then we will move on, remembering that there's another chance at the end for these questions. One is, are the owners of districts 1, 2, 3 aware of these compliance issues?
Yes.
Okay. And when do we need to comply by? So that's a good question about the state's requirements.
Yeah, and the new zoning would need to be in place by end of December 2024.
Great. So thank you all for your questions. Again, we'll have another opportunity to ask questions at the end. So as you think of them, please type them in and then we'll get to them as we go through. So I want to talk a little bit about building typologies now. Again, as Eric said, level of density that could happen around the station is a little bit different from, I think, what we were thinking before we ran the model. And people often have a very fixed idea of what multifamily housing looks like. And so what we wanted to talk about was the definition of multifamily in the legislation and the regulations, and what that could actually look like, and show you some examples, not of sketches, not of renderings, but of actual built options around some of the areas of the Commonwealth, and kind of how they might fit into the density requirements in this area. So basically, what could that density of 9 to 12 dwelling units per acre look like? And importantly, and this is why we've got a poll and are having this meeting and the one on March 8th, what are the appropriate, not just the appropriate density for the station area, but the appropriate building types for the station area, and whether or not these building types address housing needs. So again, this isn't just, we have to meet this requirement, let's just see what meets it. It's what is it that Littleton needs in terms of housing, and what type of housing typologies, what type of building, what type of units would actually fit that. And so, Littleton, I'm sure, in common with other communities, has some housing needs. I know that across the communities that Eric and I have been working with, many communities need places for seniors to retire to that are, one level living, a little bit smaller units, places for younger people. Somebody mentioned affordable housing. There's all sorts of housing. And I think that a lot of people have an image of this mid-rise or even higher. This is from missingmiddlehousing.com. It's a great website to look at. And so this website and a lot of planning discussions have been on the typologies, the types of buildings between the detached single-family houses and these mid-rise or even higher. So what we're going to look at today is this range of building types in missing middle housing, and that includes duplexes with a caveat, fourplexes, triplexes, or three families, these courtyards, townhouse, and the stacked triplex. We're going to look at a variety of these. And one of the other things that we're going to be talking about as we look at this is the idea of clustering the buildings. Now, I mentioned there's a caveat on the duplex. The definition for multifamily in the legislation is it's three family, or it is you can have more than one building on a site, and that's why I mentioned clusters. We could have clustered housing here. So you're going to see some examples of that. And again, as we go through this, there's a couple of data sources. I've got links to Residensity at the end. You might find that interesting, and some links to some other sources. So when you go back on the web to look at this, it would be fun for you to go in and see some of this information. So this is one of the options. These are 10 units across 2 buildings. This is in Newburyport. We want to give you the address in the town so you can go and find it. And what we were looking for is more recent examples of built multifamily housing, so you could see what it would look like in context. These buildings are on a lot size of 1.1 acres, and that gives us 9.12 units per acre. So at the lower end of what we're looking at. Now, what we wanted to think about is, how do you get to 150 units, right? If we're looking at this type of housing, how do you get to this? Well, I just took this one building, which is 5 units in this one building. You would need 30 of these buildings to get to 150 units over 16.5 acres, taking how the building fit on its current site and multiplying out. And obviously, you're still getting that 9 units per acre. So now this is actually a 4-family. It's a very, very long 4-family, but when you start counting the entries, there's one here, one here, one here, one down here. There's some garages on either side. This is a 4-family unit. It's on a lot size of 17,000 square feet, which gives us a units per acre of about 10. And so you need a 4-family, you need 37.5 of these buildings to get to 100 units, and it would be over 14.63 acres as it's currently calculated. So you'll see these outlines, and what I want you to think about is, in addition to how many of the types of buildings would be needed to fit on it, is how do these buildings feel in terms of fitting into Littleton? Are these buildings consistent with a form that you've seen before, a style that you've seen before? So as I said, we'll get to the poll and you'll have an option to weigh in on some of these. This is a brick building, an older brick building. It's actually a rehab, but its form is very classic, sort of New England, the pitch roof, the brick material. It actually has 20 units in it, over 1.26 acres, which gives us a nice 15.484 acres. And you can see that because it's more units per building, you'd only need 7.5 of these over 9.45 acres. So this is looking at, again, this is more units in a taller building, but you need fewer of those buildings. And one of the things that's interesting about the Littleton station site, of course, is that some of it is greenfield, or a lot of it is green. Parts of it are greenfield, and there's wetlands in the area. So if we think of clustering buildings together so that we can preserve more open space, we may want to look at as part of the discussion we're having today and at the next meeting, what does it mean to have maybe taller buildings with more units, but taking up less built footage? So this is another 4-unit building. Again, you can start counting doorways to see that. It's long, not quite as long as the other one. This one is on a 10,000 square foot acre or 10,000 square foot lot. So it's got slightly higher units per acre. And you start to see how the number of units plus land area works together to create this density. We're going to see in a little bit some images that show that some of these have open space around them. And that's why the lot might be a little bit larger. So again, for units, we need 37.5 of these to get to 150 units, and we get a units per acre of 17.42. So that's helping that average. Now, this is one of the ones that I'm going to show how this fits on. This is actually 11 units, and I sort of circled around in Google Earth and Bing to figure it out. I think it's actually broken up into 3 separate buildings. The lot size is a little bit larger because there's more units and they're spread out. So these are really attached. You can see the garages here, attached homes. You still have the sort of the New England style of the peaked roofs, but this is obviously in a tight urban space. So, you know, when we look at the lot size that it's taking up, yes, they're all clustered together, but the individual units don't have a lot of common space around them. But in looking at the form, you know, this is a form that you feel fits in. And then looking at, you need 13.6 of these sort of clusters in order to make 150 units. So again, you see if you're having these single units on the ground, it's using more land than if you're going up. On the other hand, it might leave some options open for thinking about open space. Back in Newburyport for this, 10 units over 3 buildings. It's 4 here, 5 here, and 1 here on 0.62 acres. So we get units per acre of 16.15. And if we just take this building, the 4-unit, we need, again, 37.5. If we take the 5-unit building, which is pretty much exactly the same, just 1 unit longer, we'd need 30 of those to make 150 units. And depending on whether we're doing the 4-unit or the 5-unit, we're getting a 19 to 24. So you can start to see how the density is ticking up with more units on a smaller area of space. Now, again, looking at this, there's not a lot of open space around these buildings. This one here is actually 2 units, but you could see how this easily could become a triplex. Smaller lot size for the 2. So this lot size here is just for the 2 units, the 4,500 square feet, and you get about 19 units per acre. And this would assume a cluster zoning where all of these 2 families would be on a single site. If you were going to have them broken up, they would have to be a minimum of 3 family under the guidelines. So you can see 1 2-family called out here. You need 75 2 families, obviously 53 families to get to 150 units. This is another 2-unit, 2-family on here. It's a much smaller lot. There's some parking in the back, but it's not a lot of circulation, and circulation does add required square footage at the ground level. So with such a small lot size, you get a quite high units per acre. If you take this up to being a triplex, you know, to a 3-family townhouse, again, you'd need 50 buildings like this to get to your 150 units. Another 4-unit size, slightly smaller lot size, because this driveway comes straight off the street. You don't need a lot of circulation around the buildings. A little bit more contemporary, but still with the New England pitch roof, just a little variation on it, parking directly underneath, again, making that a little bit more of an efficient site. Much higher units per acre, and you need same thing with all of the 4 families. This is 3 families, so 1, 2, 3. It's actually an older building, but you can see that form could be very easily translated. Again, parking's on the street, so this lot size is not very large, but you can see how that might work in a cluster development. Again, higher units per acre of 23 to get to this. And then this is obviously a very contemporary one. It is a 3-story building, which is not far off some of the others that we've seen. Actually, I think that first building really qualified as a 3-story. It was just broken up with shed dormers. But this is 4 buildings, and I'm showing this to you because it ticks. I'm showing this to you for 2 reasons. One is it ticks over that 150 units that we've been talking about. It's on 4.36 acres and at 189 units, and it's 4 separate buildings. And here are the 4 separate buildings. So you see that they're around an open space. The 4 buildings here. And one of the reasons I chose this location is because it's near, in this case, a green line, but it's near a transit platform and it's near a community path. And in some of the earlier planning efforts, there was some discussion about possibly having a connecting path as a community amenity in this area. So I thought this would be a nice one to show you, because as you look at those 150 units, you have this option of, you know, are they zoned to spread out? Or are they zoned to be more compact? And this is one example of how things could be more compact. So with that, we're going to take a deep breath. I'm going to give you a minute or so to access the poll. So again, you can either scan the QR code with a smartphone if you have one, or assuming since you're all on Zoom, you have access to your computers and you can type in the URL, www.surveymonkey.com. R Littleton 0209 for tonight's meeting. So I'll give you another minute, and then we're going to go through and test some of your preferences. And once we've done that, we'll have a Q&A. And I see a couple of questions have been answered so far by Maren. So I hope you all are seeing those come through as well. Just checking while you look at that to see if there's anything I need to speak to.
Just wanted to state that I will be attempting to put the QR code on the planning board page of the website under the MBTA communities page that we have.
I will send you the QR code so you don't have to strip it from this. So I'll give you the link. All right. So hopefully everybody's there. I am going to start going into the poll. Now, unfortunately, this can't, I don't know how many of you have done Zoom polls before. Usually you get the answer immediately afterwards. I have it set up. So once we finish the poll, I can come back to you as the answers come in and tell you what they all were, but we are not doing it live the way you would for a Zoom poll. And that's because we want people who may be watching this live streaming or later on to be able to take part. So let's have a look at these clusters of duplexes. So we have 2 options here of duplexes, or that could also be the triplexes. So looking at the form of this versus the form of that, this one's on a slightly smaller acreage per unit. This has a little bit more space, but you can see how this is out. As you look at these 2 developments, which do you prefer, A or B, in looking at duplexes versus triplexes? And I will give everybody a minute or so to think about it. I should set up a timer on the clock. I'll count it down. Eric, I see your hand up.
Emily, I just want to say there are 1 or 2 questions in the chat that I think might relate to the poll, so I didn't want you to.
Thank you. That's a good point. Yes,
Yeah.
there's one question that says, what would happen if you didn't partake? Absolutely nothing. This is totally voluntary. We just wouldn't get your input on your preferences. That's all. So, but, and you know, if you don't want to take it tonight, if you'd rather think about it, again, the presentation will be on the website. You're going to be able to, I see the list of survey URL there. I'm going to do that in just a second. You will be able to, you will be able to take this at a later date if you'd rather sit there and think about it. That's fine. We just wanted a little bit of interactivity. So let me just set this up. And I understand now there's a there's a question here that says these duplexes are ugly. Now that is fair enough. That is a matter of taste. We're trying to think about not necessarily the materials used about this, but just about the form of the buildings, pitched roof versus flat roof. You know, we're doing zoning here. We're not doing a project. So let me see if I can figure out how to type the answer, because unfortunately I hit the wrong button. And let me see if I can go to back to the question there. In the meantime, while I do that, we're going to go on to the 4 families, and I will put in the URL. So you can all have a look at that. And let me put this in here. Okay, in the answer should be the URL. Hopefully you can all find that. So again, we had several options for these 4 family buildings. One's a lot more traditional, one's more contemporary, one is kind of a mix. They all had different square footages. So in terms of the number of acres, or different land requirements in terms of the number of acres. So you can start to see how many, you know, how clustered would these buildings be. Obviously, A is going to be a little bit more spread or a little bit more clustered. B is going to be the more spread out of those units. Do you have a sense of what you would like there? And again, the way we're using this is for our next stage, we're hoping to do some basic modeling to show you how some of your preferences might actually fit on one or more of these sites. So your input here really helps us for the March meeting. We're not holding you to it. This is just to get a temperature of what you're thinking. And then, all right, I will give a minute or two and we'll move on to this. So this is interesting. These are both traditional style New England buildings in that they've got traditional mix of materials, brick versus the clapboard. They're both pitched roofs, but one of them is a 3-family. That's going to, you know, require a lot more spreading out. One of them is a taller building that can fit more units in it. So ignoring the form and the materials, how do you feel about the height? Do you prefer A, which is a taller building with more units, allows for more open space around it? Or do you prefer more of B, which is what you would require to get to 150 units, but that shorter height? And you can see we're trying to isolate some of the choices that we might need to make based on the answers that you're giving us. So that's why I picked two traditional looking, relatively traditional looking buildings with pitched roofs. I want to focus on taller and more units versus smaller and fewer units. All right, I will move to the next one. So now we're going to talk a little bit about clusters of buildings. You've seen these before. And so one reason for clustering the buildings together, creating a cluster style development, is to preserve the maximum amount of open space. To the wetlands are obviously not going to be built on anyway, but not to get too close to those, to preserve the idea of a buffer between the residential existing residential neighborhoods in any development that goes on here. So we wanted to test. Those others were individual units or individual buildings that could be spread out or put together either way. But these next two choices are really about clusters. So here's the first one. You can remember the 11 units on the other side. This is that building that I said was 4, 5, and 1, and you can see it here. Here's the 4, here's the 5, and here's the 1. Both of these are relatively tight spaces, and they're going to be in opposition to the ones that you see next. So we're pairing the relatively tight spaces together to see what your preferences are, A or B. You can see that the clusters of buildings aren't too far off. You need 13.6 clusters of these, effectively 3 buildings here. It might be 4. You're going to need 15 clusters of these 3 buildings here to get to the 150. About the same acreage because there's not a lot of open space between these buildings. Slightly better units per acre just because of the way the math works. So they're not too far off in terms of what they're producing, but they do have a very different feel to them. And with that, I'm going to go to the second round. And so these are in opposition. You saw B before, looking at it from the aerial view. This is the very first one we looked at. So here are the units here. And actually this parcel does not include the building in the corner here. That's a separate parcel, but it does include this open space. So when you're looking at these buildings and looking at these buildings, you see that there's a central open space for both of these. Obviously, you'd need 15 clusters of these 2 5-unit buildings. The analysis didn't count those, but just assume 15 clusters of this, or just that, because this is, again, actually be less than that because this is 189 units. So you wouldn't even need as much as this to equal 15 of those clusters because those are only 10-unit buildings. So I'll give you a few minutes on those. All right, and then as your answers are coming in to the survey, I'll go in a few minutes and check them. But in the meantime, I see a few Q&A coming up, so I shall delegate some to be answered by others and answer mine a few myself. Maren, I see one that I think is probably for you. Up at the top here, is there a residential / mixed-use development proposal in place within a half mile of the train station, or is all of this conceptual?
The planning board doesn't have any current applications for residential or mixed-use development, but over the past probably 3 years, we've seen a handful of different proposals, especially for the 245 Taylor Street site, which is immediately adjacent to the parking. So it is conceptual, but the zoning will likely make a difference for the town.
Yes, and just to reiterate, we are doing zoning. We are not doing, none of these are for a specific project. They're to understand how best to establish the rules that the zoning would create. Let's see. We are only looking at 3 particular parcels. Is it not true that the town could rezone any piece of land within the half-mile radius, including existing housing such as Concord and Lincoln have done? Eric, do you want to talk about the half-mile radius piece, and then maybe Maren address the particular geography?
Yeah, I was looking at that question while you were going through the poll, and I mean, from a guidelines perspective, I think it is true that the town could look at rezoning or considering any parcels within that half-mile radius, such that they're not environmentally constrained or something like that. But from the zoning perspective, I don't think there's any limitations really on what the town could do. I'm not familiar with what Concord or Lincoln have done. We have seen other communities, at least that we're working with, looking at neighborhoods or commercial districts or downtowns where they have existing housing. I think the difference here, again, I'm not as familiar with Concord and Lincoln as I am with Littleton, but I think the difference here with Littleton is the area immediately around the train station is a lot more undeveloped, I think, in some cases, than maybe say other communities that might be on the commuter rail, like closer to Boston. But I believe the town could, look at creating districts wherever within the half mile.
Maren, anything that you need to add or want to add at this stage?
Yeah, I'll have to say that I'm not familiar with what Concord and Lexington are looking to do either. But I would note that both of them do have commuter rail stations in their downtowns.
Merlin, I have to apologize to you. I did not see your comment at the time where you asked A is a 4-story, B is a 3-story. So I'd have to go back, but my apologies if you remember which slide that was on. I was just quickly ticking back this to see if this was that one, but it wasn't. So apologies for missing that at the time. And then we had, are we able to set low or non-existent parking minimums for the district to potentially reduce the impact on roads, traffic, green space? And the answer is yes. Parking is certainly part of the model and it's part of the zoning. And so that will be our discussions, today and on March 8th, especially when we start looking at how all these fit together. So parking minimums could be part of that discussion. And then Concord, Mass is not bringing MBTA communities to town vote until spring 2024. Feel free to check. Thoughtful approach. So just reading that out. All right, so no more questions at this time, but I'm just going to go into the next steps and then I'll come back and talk through the polls. So if you have any more questions as we go through the steps, that's fine. Feel free to type them in. We are going to have our next public meeting on March 8th. And we will have a new online questionnaires, it says, that will be available from March 8th to March 17th. That implies that there's one now. So let me talk through what we have available for you. So after tonight, this presentation will be up on the website. Obviously, the poll that you just took will still be live. So people viewing this in a PDF will be able to link to the poll and take it there. And obviously, I can see through the poll responses who responded tonight and who responded afterwards. There is a second link to a questionnaire, and it's basically an open-ended form that asks you if you have any questions after reviewing the presentation or any comments. And these will both be open until March 3rd. That's to give us a chance to review questions and comments before the March 8th meeting so that we can address anything that comes forward at the time. And it also asks, did you attend this meeting? Did you see that it's online? Did you just review the PowerPoint presentation again? So we can get a sense of who's getting which information when. And then Maren, do we have an update on the March 8th meeting in terms of location?
Yes, we do. We were able to secure a meeting room for March 8th. I believe that I told you that was going to be room 103 of the Littleton town offices.
Yes, so we're delighted to report that we will be able to do this meeting. The March 8th meeting we'll be able to do in person. There were timing restrictions on being able to do this in person. So we certainly appreciate everybody's flexibility in going to a Zoom meeting, but we're looking forward to going through the next steps in person. And then after that, the first draft will be due again for staff review March 15th. That's where we, say this is what we think we heard. Have we heard correctly? Did we miss some? Did we, the consultant team, miss anything? And then start putting it forward for review by the planning board, both at an initial presentation, see if there's any comments or tweaks. planning board hearing, and then obviously coming forward to present something to the planning board that they can take forward to town meeting. Marin's email is up here. If you have any additional questions, obviously we hope that you put it in the link. And I see another comment coming through, which we'll take in a minute. Here is a link for any additional thoughts about the presentation. So feel free to go to this link. It is on the town's website. That will be open until March 3rd. There's a questionnaire link on there. The poll link will be on there. And this bottom one is just a note to anybody who may be reading this presentation or watching it afterwards that this is available for them. I did mention resources. So Residensity, which provided the base information that allowed us to calculate these densities, really very useful. It shows residential density on a town-by-town basis in Massachusetts. So if you're interested in more details, if you want more information about the MBTA Communities Act, that's the link right here. And then Mass Housing Partnership also has this Center for Housing Data called DataTown. It's a really good way to get a good understanding of what community needs are for housing. They pull a lot of data together. It also allows you to compare it against other communities. So it's a nice resource that I like to give to people. So before I do a thank you, I'm going to just jump back to the polls so I can give the results. But before that, we have two comments. First is train station area on Foster Street doesn't have any amenities, no sidewalk, grocery, drugstores, etc. Is there? I think it meant to be a thought on addressing this. So
I'm happy to jump in on that one. There is currently federal funding for reconstruction of Foster Street, the section of Foster Street from Taylor up past the commuter rail station to Balsam Lane. That reconstruction includes a 10-foot wide multi-use path along the side. And then the other two sections of Foster Street, the one from Tehadawon to Harwood and the one from Harwood to Balsam Lane, are under design with the Littleton DPW on what to do with those sections and how to connect the commuter rail station to our downtown with bicycle paths, walking or sidewalks. And some of that is location dependent, depending on where along Foster Street there's room for a path versus less room is required for a sidewalk. And then as far as mixed use, any commercial, I guess I would answer that, but that could be addressed through this rezoning process if the residents are interested in seeing mixed use there as well.
yeah, and that's a great segue to the fact that although multifamily is required, you are allowed to have other uses as part of your district. And so that may be something that we could explore more on March 8th. We wanted to introduce the idea of the typologies tonight, but are there other uses that might be consistent with multifamily as, that cafe near the train station, neighborhood services or retail or something like that? I think that's well worth a discussion on that, but that is allowed. You just have to allow multifamily as of right. So, and then we have two questions on the meeting format, one for the next meeting to be hybrid and another the ability to watch a meeting or watch the presentation without going to a meeting. We need to talk about the format for the next meeting. It will not be hybrid just because of the type of exercises we were planning, but we may be able to figure out how to tape it. I think, Marin, we can talk about that.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that part of it. Yes, LCTV is taping this session, and I will ask them to tape the next session as well, which means that they're automatically uploaded to the LCTVs on demand, and you can watch it at any time.
And we will certainly do the same thing we did tonight, which is to set up a way to get to have the presentation online, to get comments from people who weren't able to be at the meeting. We understand people's time is very precious and trying to make it as easy as possible for people. So we will offer those options. So the results of the poll, this one, poll one, A was the clear preference over B. In poll two, A and B scored exactly the same. C got no love whatsoever. Actually, that's not true. It had one person liked C. So I think that gives us some useful information as we take the next step. Poll three, A got 12 responses or 57%. Sorry, I should have said the other ones. In poll one, A got 85% of the responses, 18 people, and B got just over 14, 3 people. In poll two, A and B both got 47.62, 10 people each, and C got 1 person, 4.76. So here on three, A got 57.14 or 12, and B got 42.86. Sorry, I had to loom in there because the writing's so small. So that was 9 people responding for B. In question 4, A got 17 responses or 80.95%, and B got 19.5%, which is 4 responses. So more preference for A. And then in question 5, the second cluster's A was the clear winner at 75% or 15 people, and B 25% or 5 people. So again, this direction is very helpful for us as we try to think about the next step of visualizing how some of these typologies could work on the site. So really appreciate that. And with that, Maren, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you very much. Mark, did you want to take some input from the board members on this, or
Sure.
what's your preference?
Actually, if we want to weigh in for a couple of minutes, I'll start with anyone who wants to talk first. Jeff, do you want to weigh in?
I had a couple notes. I liked the framing of this as providing missing middle housing. If we were to tell a story, that would, I think, be the story that we could tell that is understandable, as opposed to what's going on at the Common, which is something different. I am interested in the affordable question. This would be subject, presumably, to our inclusionary housing. We have to be careful not to build housing without a set aside for affordable. Otherwise, we run the risk of falling below 10%, which we're well above now. I would like to point out to anyone that there are several projects nearby this site that people could look at. One is Charles Ridge, which is a, could have been used as one of the examples, and that's in Littleton. And then there's one called Trail Ridge in Harvard that's off Whitcomb, which was a 40B. And those are 2 and 3 unit buildings that look house-like. And then the other point about neighborhood services, we were allowing for that in our previous MBTA station. I remember at the time being skeptical myself about whether it would be economically feasible, but that doesn't mean we can't zone for it.
Thank you. Bartlett?
Well, I have to agree with Jeff. I would like to see some retail or some commercial there at the train station. I would like to see a variety of housing types. I think the 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s were very informative. To look at, but I would like to see a mix, and I would like to see greater density right around the train station. If we're going to go, to one of the other parcels, I still like to see a lot of things. And the other sort of general question I have is thinking about how we combine the parcel into common with the station area. I really would like to have the zoning set up so that the station area could be eventually a functioning village. And I don't want to have, you know, the minimum number of units that we are allowed down there, because I don't think that would really function as a village, and I think it would be self-defeating.
Thank you. Anna?
Hi, everyone. So Bartlett, to your point about a functioning village, that makes me wonder, Emily, would it be possible to perhaps make that a question for the next time in the poll? You know, what do other residents think about that particular idea? So thank you for those words, Bartlett. Given the number of questions that came up around infrastructure, I would like to ask that there be something within this proposed bylaw that identifies either our existing 173-88, which really has a lot of identification of infrastructure, so that future projects that are being considered actually need to comply with providing us as the planning board with the information related to infrastructure items like sewer and utilities and traffic, school facilities, the economics of the cost and revenues, so that for each of the developments we get that.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate what Jeff had to say. We're looking more towards housing down there, multi-family housing. I don't think we need to get lost in how many acres we need. I think we have more than an adequate amount of acres. I think it's got to look similar to what we're used to, meaning two duplexes. Littleton's not about the height of it. I think that's going to be adjusted with common. It's more about, like you said, a clustered individual development down there. We're looking for empty nesters, maybe smaller units. Some of those were 3 stories tall for a single unit. We're looking at condos, multiple condos out there, and we have a parcel that's 30 acres. We have another parcel that's 37 acres. So we have plenty of room to fit everything and have a lot of green space. So it's not about how dense we can make it. It's how it's going to fit into what everybody expects down at the train station now. Where the high rises are all going to be in the common. The understanding now is moving forward is that we're going to have smaller housing out there for seniors, for empty nesters, things like that, that kind of go with the neighborhood that's down there. So I think we should be more focused on that than worrying about how many could sneak into an acre and a half. The lower style unit, my personal opinion is the lower, like a condo, like we see around the towns that are around us, are more in keeping of what we're going to probably want. I think the residents are going to be more understanding and accepting those kind of things rather than 3-story boxes that look like 100-year-old housing that was built in Concord or West Acton or something like that. So, and other than that, I agree with Bartlett that by the time we're done, if we do this right, it will be its own little community down there, and there should be some amenities, and it should be a functioning independent neighborhood once we're done with it. Other than that, I think you've done a great job about making sure that we're in compliance with what the state is asking us to do. Looking forward to seeing more renderings of, and maybe some of the other stuff, maybe if the next meeting, some of the other stuff that we had in the other, maybe some of the drawings that were there, because they did have a couple of, if I remember correctly, clustered zoning. We want to have higher density in one area and then clustered zoning up in the others. Maybe we could see some of the other projects that were before us 2 years ago. That would help as well. Anyway, thank you.
While we have the planners with us, I want to Bartlett's comment. What constitutes a village? I mean, how many what would a planner say? How many housing units would you need to have the support for a village feeling? Because it may be out of reach on one of, I mean, we have it on the common, but that's many, many, many more. I'm just curious from a planner point of view. What would you say?
An interesting question. I wouldn't say that it's, Eric might disagree with me, so, feel free to jump in. I wouldn't say that it's a specific number of units. I think it's more about the layout and the mix of uses for a village. Just as a note, we weren't forgetting about what you already had in your 40R. We just were focusing tonight on the multifamily portion of it. But I think it's more about the supportable mix. Eric, do you have additional thoughts?
I agree with you on the unit piece. The one comment that I think was in the chat, and I know a few of the planning board members talked about the commercial side, the grocery stores, the pharmacies, the retail. That's where you're going to need more housing units, so you have more household spending to support that. The grocery, maybe a tiny grocery store, tiny would work only because what you have at the point, the market basket at this point, I think there's like a Donnellan's, maybe an Acton, if that's still there. That's a lot of folks are probably doing their day-to-day or their weekly grocery shopping there. So grocery is always a hard one, but I think maybe, a restaurant, a coffee shop, something that doesn't compete with or take away from what's happening in the common, I think would be, feasible, but I think this would probably need to be the majority housing with maybe a couple of like small spaces here and there for walkable neighborhood retail or food options or something like that.
And then one more question about mixed use. Should there be an allowance for parking use for the MBTA station? I mean, before the pandemic, it was really, really crazy there.
Mm-hmm.
It is not now, but it was then. So
yeah, that needs to be.
I mean, should our zoning allow? I mean, this is tough because we're not designing a project. We have to keep reminding people that we're making some parameters that someone who does design it comes in and works with, and so it's tough. I'm a design professional, so it's hard for me not to start thinking about how things would go. But anyway, so but it's been really useful.
It is tough not to try and design it, and it's one of the reasons we try and do flexible modeling that leads to flexible zoning regulations. I think the other thing to remember too is that this is as of right zoning, so it's with site plan review.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a different level. Certainly some communities are more used to the special permit review rather than site plans. So figuring out how you make the regulations flexible enough to work under those conditions while still producing a result that the community feels comfortable with is, it's why we're having these discussions to figure out how that works. I wanted to, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to touch on a couple of other things. Jeff, you'd mentioned Charles Ridge. We don't usually use as examples from the community itself, just because it can be awkward when you put somebody's home up and somebody writes,
Sure.
Or speaks out that they don't like it. But we'll certainly look at Charles Ridge, and I think Trail Ridge was the other one that you mentioned.
Yeah, I'm not sure they're those are what I was thinking around. I mean, there's like Acorn, there's an Acton, there's a condo development from like 30 years ago that is similar to what anyway, I mean, keying on what Mark said, I think that's what the I can't speak for everyone, but market wise, and people come out here to be in more of a discrete unit rather than an aggregate of many units. So we're doing that in the common. I think we need to do something or allow for something different here.
Makes sense. And Anna, thank you for the reference to 17388. I'll have a look at that and see how it can be tied in. and the implications that it has. And then you also mentioned affordable housing. That is something, again, we're focusing just on sort of the format, how this works, but looking at your existing affordable housing regulations with respect to the guidelines put out by DHCD as something that we are also doing, and we will have some recommendations for you on that as well. So it's not a component that we've lost sight of. It just wasn't part of today's discussion, but we have not forgotten about that.
So there are still a couple questions and we have a couple minutes. Perhaps we could jump into the first ones. Would the units end up being purchased or rented? Zoning does not address the ownership style. So that would be up to an eventual developer to decide that. I think the input from town folks is essential. I would agree. And I believe that's why the planning board has scheduled this meeting and the other meetings that will be happening. And it's ultimately up to town meeting to vote either yes or no on the proposal. And the last question, how current community will be benefited with this development? Again, there's no development proposal. The town is responding to the state law that asks us to rezone around the commuter rail station for multifamily by right. I didn't know if you had any, Emily or Eric had any wrap-up statements. I'm wanted to thank everybody for their time this evening. It was a very nice turnout, and looking forward to the next session on March 8th.
Definitely.
I agree, and I thank the consultants for their hard work that they've done in this, and we look forward to seeing you on the 8th, live.
Yes, we are very much looking forward to that. So appreciate your time today, members of the planning board, and very much appreciate the public input, the fact that you were here, that you asked so many questions. That's terrific. And that you took the poll. I was a little worried that would not be feasible, but I'm delighted to see that you participated. Can't wait to see what other answers come in from both that poll and from the other questionnaire we have. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
So
I guess we have to make a motion to adjourn, right?
no, we have board business.
Oh, we do?
We do.
Okay.
Judy was nice enough to turn off the Q&A, so I don't have to worry about that for the board business portion of the meeting. First item on was just board member input.
Does anybody have any input from since last week we met with?
Since last week, yeah.
Yeah. And then the second item was bills. There were a couple bills that need to be paid. I sent the amounts around the other day, and I'm furiously looking for that pile of paper. And then the third agenda item was the final wording on the handout for town meeting floor on Article 9. I will pull that one up. Maybe. Okay. Oh, sorry, it's taking so long to get there. Okay, now I gotta find you guys again. Share screen to share. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen with the wording for the Article 9 handout. The two changes from the discussion at last week's meeting was just to be consistent with southwesterly when we're talking about which side of Great Road. And then the other change was in the formatting of the subsections.
Okay, does the board have any questions or concerns about it? We're gonna approve it and it's gonna be a handout at town meeting, right? A little yellow piece of paper, right?
Yeah, the town administrator's office has a couple other items to put on the handout, but this would be part of it, yes.
I don't have any comments or questions about this. I have a comment or I have a question about something else though.
I think I'm okay with this also. I think the biggest achievement was determining the southwesterly, designation.
Location, yeah. I'm good with it. Violet, are you okay with it?
I'm good with it.
All right, Myron, so we're good with that. Yeah, what's next?
So I'll keep looking for the bills thing while Anna has her question.
Go ahead, Anna.
So the map that shows the yellow and then the two green areas, that will sort of remain as part of this revised motion. So
Correct.
it's the language that we're changing.
Yeah, we're not changing the map.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, we're not changing the map. Okay. Do we have a lot of bills, Myron? Or is it just green?
It was just a couple. There was a bill from August for Wellington Drive for the construction inspections that got lost in the shuffle. And then there was, and it was, I want to say around $1,200, if I recall correctly, somewhere between $800 and $1,200. And then there was also the bill from the Lowell Sun for the two different times we had to publish the public hearing notice for the firearms bylaw. There was some miscommunication on that. It was published 4 times total. The first 2 were not correct. And then we republished with 2, but we're still responsible for that $1,400 cost on that.
Okay,
So those are the 2 bills.
So-
With your permission, I'd just like to have Lucia send those around by DocuSign for approval to the whole board.
Board have any questions or concerns? So the first one, actually, we should take care of the first one for Wellington Drive because he's coming in at some point to ask for his bond release. So we should get that out, make sure everything's paid and taken care of before he requests a bond release on that. So let's get that one paid, and the Lowell Sun is the Lowell Sun. Any questions or concerns? Otherwise, let's just have Myron send it out and we can all DocuSign it.
Okay.
And nothing, I'm going to assume that everybody's good with that.
Yeah.
Okay. So we don't need to vote on that. Anything else? Or is that it? Till the 7th, till March 7th.
Right, but we're going to be at
Town meeting. Yeah, we're all going to be at town meeting, right?
Yep.
Okay, and that's what? 7?
Wednesday.
Wednesday at 7? Is that when it starts?
Yeah.
7 o'clock.
Mhm.
Okay, great.
I move we adjourn.
Anyone want to second that?
I'll second it.
All in favor, signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you.